Welcome back, Doomtown fans. Willingdon here, and we're going to look at part 2 of Frontier Justice. In this review, we're going to be looking at all of the non-dude cards in the pack. We're going to start things off with a couple deeds, and the first one that we have is Shane and Graves Security. This is a 5 of diamonds, it's 2 to play with 1 income, and it's worth a control point. It's private, controller shootout boot. A 2-stud gunslinger token joins your posse at this or an adjacent deed. Remove the gunslinger token from the game after the shootout. This is a really interesting deed. I'm a little bit mixed on it though. The 5 I think fits into quite a few draw structures, especially the more aggressive decks. And the fact that it's cheap to play for a control point and an income, that seems pretty decent to me. The gunslinger thing, I'm not as sold on. It seems like it's going to be really hard to use that offensively, since it's going to basically just be at your deeds. So if you're playing an aggressive deck, you're going to have your opponent start a fight on your turf, which is not something I think that happens all that often. This could be kind of nice for like reinforcing one of your weaker dudes who was at some location, maybe using like a whiskey flask or something like that. I don't really see this seeing a lot of play in the more control-oriented decks. At first, that's kind of what I thought about this. I was like, hey, this would be kind of nice for defending your deeds as Morgan. But it occurs to me that if they gain control of this deed and you can't contest it, that could be a huge problem. They're going to be able to probably get into some fights with, your Irving or just some chump dude with just this gunslinger thing. They do have to start a shootout. That's going to be a little harder to do, but the gunslinger plus like any guy is going to roll most of the Morgan Cattle Company dudes. So I do see this kind of being a liability if you played it in a more control-oriented deck. If you lose control of the deed, it could be a problem. So I don't know. I think that this could see some play. I think that the value is really good for quite a few decks, and I think the stats on the deed are really good. I'm just not sure how often that gunslinger thing is going to come up. The next deed that we have is called Gomorrah Jail. It's a 10 of diamonds, it's 1 to play, 0 income, and it's worth a control point. Private, government, and core. That's a new keyword. You may start with this deed in play in place of 1 Law Dogs dude. Controller react boot. When another player's wanted dude is discarded during the high noon phase, this deed permanently gains a control point. Well, thematically, this card is pretty awesome. The idea that their dudes are discarded, they go back into the deck, they're just in jail for a while, and then they come back. I like that idea. Now, this core thing, this letting it start in play at the beginning of the game, that seems pretty good and pretty powerful. You're going to start the game with an extra control point, but other than that, this is kind of just going to sit around, right? Like, I don't think this is really going to do a lot for you immediately. I think that it's going to take maybe a turn or two before you're really able to get any value out of this thing. Long term, though, this seems pretty strong. The ability to ramp up, 2-3 control points on this thing throughout the game, that seems really strong. And generally speaking, the Law Dogs are pretty good at gaining control of their own deeds. So I don't think it's going to be a huge liability for you to have this thing in play worth 3 or 4 control points. So this is pretty interesting. I really like this effect. This sort of reminds me of the Union Casino in some respects, because it's a deed that's kind of a long-term way to gain a lot of control points. I think, again, like I said with some of the other cards, this is going to be better with the original Law Dogs rather than the new Arsenal, just because you're going to easily be able to make a lot of their guys wanted, and this is going to be a lot stronger if you can distribute wanted among a few guys so that pretty much whenever they're discarding a guy, you're getting a control point. So this thing's really interesting. I really like the starting with it in play aspect, especially when it's really cheap. and I think there's going to be a lot of Law Dogs players trying this thing out. Now we're starting to get to the goods cards, and the first one that we have is Diable en Boîte, or Deviled Box, better known as a Jack in the Box in English. This is an Ace of Hearts. It's 0 to play. It's a mystical weapons gadget, and it's difficulty 2. React Boot, when this dude is aced or discarded in a shootout, send one dude in this shootout home booted and draw a card. This thing's a little bizarre. I'm not exactly sure how to feel about this thing. I really like that React Boot ability. That seems pretty good. I think that there's going to be a fair number of decks that have some disposable dude that it's going to be okay to lose him with this attached and then get that value out of him. Now, it does seem a little awkward since it's a gadget, and that's going to obviously limit it to decks that play Mad Scientists. Now, my biggest problem with this is that it's Ace, so if you are playing other gadgets, it's going to be a bad pull for them, and that seems kind of like a liability in the gadget decks that I've been trying out. So I don't know. I think this effect is decent. I think this card could see some play, but the low pull value and the kind of strange nature of this card makes me think that it's probably going to make more sense in the future. Next up, we have another goods card. This is Legal Instruments. It's a 4 of hearts, 2 to play, and it has +1 control points. It's unique. It's an improvement. This card attaches to an unbooted in-town deed you control. This deed gains government keyword, and deputies at this deed get +2 influence and +3 value. Right away, I'm excited about the idea of having more goods cards that attach to deeds. I think in a vacuum, goods cards attaching to deeds would be easier to use than goods cards attached to dudes. But all of the good cards that we've seen that attach to deeds have been really specialized and kind of awkward to use. This is not an exception to that. You're going to pretty much only want to play this in Law Dogs, I would say. It seems to me like the deputies thing is probably the most powerful aspect. I don't think there's quite enough stuff there with the government keyword for that to really make much of a difference. The +1 control point, that's pretty cool. I like that. You are going to be paying 2 Ghost Rock, and you do have to include this card to get that. You got to ask yourself, would it be better to just play another deed? I think in a huge number of situations, it would be better to play another deed. So this is probably going to be the type of thing where it's fleshing out a draw structure, and or it's interacting really well with some of the cards in your deck based on keywords like deputies or government. I really like the +2 influence on the deputies for its interaction with the core set Law Dogs ability, the original Law Dogs. That seems pretty good. You can be able to give some guy a bounty that you wouldn't normally be able to, and you wouldn't have to boot your best guy. You could boot like Philip Swinford or something like that. So the +3 value, that seems okay too. The idea that that'll protect you against like shotgun and stuff. This card's okay. I think it's an interesting card. I'm not immediately sure that I want to include it in my Law Dogs decks, but I do think there is some amount of playability to this. The next goods card that we have is called Recursive Motion Machine. This is a 6 of hearts. It's 0 to play. It's a gadget with difficulty 5. If this dude is a gadget, it gets -1 upkeep. You may use Ghost Rock on this card to pay for abilities on gadgets at this location. React Boot, after this dude moves, put 1 Ghost Rock on this card. This is the type of card that maybe in the future will make some more sense, but I think for now this card is downright terrible. There's a bunch of things wrong with it. First of all, the first ability, the -1 upkeep, I would argue that's the best aspect of the card. I think that's better than the Ghost Rock thing for React Boot. And that only works if the dude is a gadget. Well, there's exactly one dude in the game that is a gadget. And for the most part, I don't think I was too concerned that he cost 1 upkeep. The big nail in the coffin for me is the fact that this thing is a 6 of hearts. If you're going to play a gadget-oriented deck with Quaterman, you're going to want to have gadgets that are guns or have some sort of bullet bonus. And one of the best ones in the game right now is Holy Wheel Gun, just because you get 2 bullets and it also has a semi-relevant shootout ability. This is going to conflict with your ability to play more of those. And the next card that we're going to look at in the pack is also a 6 of hearts and is also a card that you would maybe consider in that deck. So, I don't know, I think the 6 of hearts for me really kills the playability of this thing. I think if it wasn't interacting negatively at value with the best of the gadgets to use in that deck, it would be a lot more playable. I think the fact that this isn't a weapon and isn't a horse is kind of an advantage, because a lot of times you're going to be piling gadgets on one Quaterman, and you're going to hit the limit of horses and guns. You know, you can only have 1 of each per dude. This is not going to interact with that. So you could have this in addition. I don't know. This is really an iffy card for me. I think this is the type of thing that's going to maybe make more sense in the future, but for now, this is definitely going to stay in the box. The next goods card that we have is Winchester Model 1873. This is a 6 of hearts, 1 to play, has +1 bullets. It's a weapon, shootout boot. Boot this dude to give them +1 bullets and make them a stud. That's what I'm talking about. Why couldn't we have just had this thing in the core set? Here's a weapon that's actually really good, worth playing, that isn't shotgun. I think a lot of weapons, I've been including them mainly just because they kind of fit into my draw structure, and I can't get more than 12 of a certain value if I don't play hearts. And some of the weapons are like okay-ish, and I'll just throw them in because I need a couple more of that draw value. This is actually a weapon that I would consider playing just because it's awesome. And I think shotgun is probably the only weapon that's like that otherwise, and it's kind of awkward to use if you don't have a deck with lots of high bullet ratings. So I don't know, this card's really good. I think this is just generically good. It's kind of just obviously strong. You're going to make a guy a stud, and he's going to get +2 bullets once a shootout. You do have to boot him, which kind of sucks, but that I think it's going to be worth it basically every time you do it. I really like this card. I think I would like to see more of weapons like this. They're just generically good, that just give guys generically good combat stats and do relevant things in combat. I think most of the best weapons in the game are gadgets and are therefore pretty difficult to play in most decks. And it's really only been like shotgun and maybe Peacemaker and a couple other weapons that have seen extensive play. Next up, we have another goods card. This is Fancy New Hat, and that is actually the name of the card. It's a King of Hearts. It's 1 to play. It gives +1 influence. It's a tire. Abilities on other players' cards cannot reduce this dude's influence. This isn't exactly the most exciting card, but I do think it has some playability. The +1 influence is going to be really nice, especially on a card that also has this effect that I think will matter quite a bit. The fact that you can prevent your guy's influence from being reduced seems really nice if you're trying to take over their deed, or if you're worried about recurring effects that often reduce the guy's influence, things like Blood Curse. I think this is especially strong against 4th Ring because they tend to play quite a few effects that reduce the influence of your dudes, especially Blood Curse, as I just had mentioned, and things like Rumors. So this card, I think, has some amount of playability. It's going to be a high pull value. It could maybe fit your draw structure at King, and it's cheap to play. I'm not going to immediately be putting this on all of my decks, but I do think that there's a few decks that could benefit from this. Next up, we have a new miracle. This is Confession. It's a 5 of hearts, 1 to play. It has Noon Miracle 6 Boot. Boot this dude to choose a dude at this or an adjacent location who gains bounty equal to this dude's blessed skill. Then it also has Noon Miracle 7 Boot. Transfer 1 bounty from a dude at this or an adjacent location to your stash. Oh man, I really like this. This is going to give away for the Law Dogs Blessed decks, the Arsenal-oriented Law Dogs decks, to actually do stuff with bounties. I think it's pretty easy to have a dude that has some level of blessed skill, and there's quite a few ways to affect his skill as well using deeds. So I think you're going to pretty often be able to give a couple bounty to a dude. That second ability is also really cool, and I think could potentially fit well in the original Law Dogs, just because you're going to pretty easily be able to give bounties to dudes, and then you're going to make the money before you actually get into an engagement with the guy. This is kind of clumsy. I think it's going to be a little awkward to like set it up and get it to work, but I think once it works, it's going to be good, and I really welcome the ability to give more bounties to dudes because there just aren't that many ways to do that in the game. Next up, we have another miracle. This is Shield of Faith. It's a 7 of hearts. It's 1 to play. It has Shootout Miracle 7 Boot. Dudes cannot be aced or discarded during this shootout, except as a casualty for losing the round or due to their owner's card abilities or traits. Reduce your casualties by 1 this round. This is another pretty solid miracle. I really like this as a powerful defensive effect. I think that a lot of the miracles have had kind of pseudo defensive effects, and this one's pretty directly defensive. It's going to be able to prevent us from taking additional casualties owing to some sort of card effect. It's also going to reduce our casualties by 1, which is really nice. I think in general, this is a must include in a miracle-oriented deck, unless you're going to try to be really aggressive, and I don't really think that's how the miracle decks play, at least in my limited experience with them. So this seems pretty decent. I like this. This is probably one of my favorite of the miracles overall, just because it's such an obviously defensive effect that's going to have a good impact as more cards are introduced in the game that affect the number of casualties you take or cause you to take casualties or things like that. I think as we see more cards that do that sort of thing, this card's just going to get better. Now we're getting to the action cards, and the first one that we have is Rope and Ride. This is a 3 of clubs. It's 0 to play. It has React after a dude accepts your call out, but before posses are formed. Boot your leader or their attached horse to move your dude, then the mark, to an adjacent location that is not your home. Boot the mark. Well, we've seen a lot of emerging horse-oriented effects, and this one's pretty good as well. I like this because it's going to let you potentially get a different shootout scenario than your opponent was thinking would occur. So, it might look like you're only going to have 1 or 2 guys in the posse, and then all of a sudden you're at a new location and there's more dudes there. I like this. I think that it has an interesting timing, that it's after the accepted call out, but, before the posses are declared. This is pretty cool. I think this could see some play, but to me it seems like it's probably going to rely on the horse, because I don't know if booting your dude is going to be worth it to do this. I guess maybe you could set up some monster plays where, all your dudes are in the town square, and then you just, boot into the town square with your opponent's dude, and all of a sudden it's your team versus their one guy. That could be good. So I like this card. I think this sets up some interesting tactical options, and I think this could see some play. The next action that we have is called Incubation. It's a 7 of clubs. It's 2 to play. It's a condition. While this card is attached, this dude gets -1 bullets, -1 influence, -3 value, and the ability Noon Boot, discard 1 attached Incubation. Then it has Noon, attach this card to a booted dude at their home. This card is kind of nasty. I think that it could potentially be a big game changer if you played it at the right time. It's kind of expensive, paying that 2, and the fact that you have to initially attach it to a booted dude at their home, that seems pretty easy to play around, and it seems like there's going to be a lot of scenarios where this is going to be a dead card in your hand. So I'm a little iffy on this thing, but it seems like you could get some pretty good value out of it. The -3 value is probably the thing that I'm seeing as being the most powerful, although the -1 influence seems like it could be pretty good in the right situation as well. So, I don't know, this card's interesting. I like this effect. I feel like maybe it's a little too expensive for what it does, but I think that it could really fit well into some like 4th ring decks that have value-oriented effects or things like that. The last card in the pack is an action card called Flight of the Lepus. It's a Jack of Clubs, it's 0 to play. Cheat and resolution. Choose up to 2 dudes controlled by you or the player within a legal draw hand. If you revealed a legal draw hand, you may choose 1 additional dude. Move those dudes home. If this is a shootout, you may boot them. So this card is pretty clearly a throwback to Jackalope Stampede from the original game, or it certainly has that sort of feel, except this card isn't broken and doesn't completely destroy the game. Now, I didn't play original Doomtown, but the consensus seems to be that Jackalope Stampede was just way too good as a cheating punisher. The fact that you could play it on low ball and it would make them discard a dude. So like you win low ball on the first turn and then you make them discard one of their starting posse. That's just ridiculous. This card, on the other hand, seems like it's a lot fairer because it doesn't have the potential of really doing a whole lot during low ball. I can see maybe some situations where sending some of their dudes home could potentially be really good during low ball, but I think for the most part, this card really shines during a shootout, and I think that's kind of the way that cheating cards should be. They should be mainly about the shootouts, because that actually involves player decision, right? Like with low ball, if you just randomly pull a full house, I mean, I've pulled full houses with like Morgan Dudes and Deeds, right? And I think everybody's had that experience where they're playing a deck with a horrible draw structure, and they just randomly draw like 3 of a particular copy of a card, and that makes them have an insane low ball hand. On the other hand, if you're actually in a shootout, there's a lot of interesting decisions about when you should cheat and when you shouldn't cheat. And I think really good players are going to know the right times to cheat and the right times not to cheat. And this is the type of card that's going to keep the cheating player honest, has a really powerful effect. I really like the Jack value. I think that's going to fit well into a lot of decks, giving us a cheat and punisher at that value. All around, I really like this card. I think this is a really interesting option going forward as a cheat and punisher. Well, that's going to do it for Frontier Justice. This is another solid effort from the Doomtown design team. I really like some of the things going on with this pack. I especially like the dudes section, where we saw a lot of no upkeep dudes, as well as some new grifters. I think both of those sections of the game need more cards. And we've also seen a lot of fleshing out of various draw structures and things like that with some of the cards in this pack. Well, I hope you liked this review. And if you did, please press that subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. And I'll see you again for some more Doomtown stuff.